Hello, guys. This is Alex Julian, or Aloysius Zanderman here. And today I have a very interesting subject for you to keep in mind. And unfortunately, this subject is going to be a little bit on the intense side if you are not able to discuss politics responsibly. For most people, when it comes to politics, any intake of politics is almost like that of the intake of a drug, in which it's like when people try to discuss politics, they are usually too dramatic, emotionless, and pathetic to be useful to anyone, even themselves. Just right here, I'm sipping a hot cup of coffee to have this table talk with you at my kitchen island here for this morning, this beautiful morning of discussion on politics. But this will not just be any politics that you can imagine. This subject I am covering has something to do with commonplace video game reviewers and commonplace video game critics. As in, those normal, average, everyday people who seem to love reviewing video games. They love criticizing video games. They love giving grades to video games. They love giving their opinions on video games, even if they are not capable of an ounce of truth anywhere they go. And you're probably wondering, well, why is that? I mean, aren't video game reviewers really telling the truth on something? Well, let's observe the character of the commonplace video game reviewer and critic to find out why I think as such against them. Now, hey, I know that I am confident, but that is because I am a video game philosopher. Do you know many people who are a video game philosopher like me? I am the kind of person who will really dig into the graves of old, forgotten video games from the past and go into history and writing of what the past was like in the 1970s and 80s and such for the upcoming revolutionary practices of video games in the arcade and home. If you are an old person, you probably remember names like Atari and Intellivision and Mattel and ColecoVision and Nintendo and Sega and Sony and Microsoft and 3DO and TurboGrafx 16 and all that kind of stuff. And definitely, at least on an informal count of my video game hobby, I am responsible enough in my logic and maturity to discuss old video games with kindness and honesty of good judgment. However, commonplace video game reviewers and commonplace video game critics are ageist. They are usually young people who just love having brand new video games while they mock old people and mock old video games. And it is their arrogance and vulgarity that brings them down to this current situation that we're in which more and more video games are dying because of these unfair fools. I mean, these commonplace video game reviewers and critics are anti-Atari, anti-Nintendo, anti-Sega, anti-anything old. They would even be anti-birth in some way. And their video game websites typically only hire young people to review video games and to criticize video games. They only bring up young reviewers and young critics to talk about video games. They will never bring in the old crowd. They will never invite their grandparents to any of their events. They will never ask their grandparents for any information on the past. They are like advertising agents. They are like cheap, foolish, and prejudiced advertising agents who constantly ram new technological gadgets up your ass and hope that somehow you'll start caring about their product. And it's gotten to the point that people have had so many new technology items go into their mouths by force that now they start to believe that all this force that they have been experiencing was actually their willpower. But it never was. There were just arrogant and vulgar young reviewers and critics who were forcing people to enjoy new video games and to disregard the past of old video games. And I'm putting it here in very blunt and truthful terms so there's no confusion. But hey, I haven't lost my wit because, let's be honest, old video games can be embarrassing to look at sometimes because old video games can be a sign of something from the past that we would probably like to forget or maybe even correct or adjust. But that does not excuse the prejudice of these modern video game reviewers and modern video game critics who are really just commonplace video game reviewers and commonplace video game critics. They are usually just young people who like new things and they make mockery and unfair prejudice against old things. And that is basically really who they are. They try to inflate their articles and their reviews and criticisms with a lot of frivolous and unofficial language that goes nowhere. They will use or pretend to use new words that nobody really knows the meanings to. They would even dare violate literary guidelines, and they would think that they could just put their pen on the paper and just make whatever scratches they want on the surface, as if like we are gamers with armor and shields strong enough to defend ourselves against their unfair attacks on video games in general. And they go for the kill. They go for the blood. And, you know, I refuse to join that kind of crowd of modern video game players because to me they're too arrogant and vulgar to understand anything. They're like monkeys in space, you know. They might as well be the monkeys in space. We don't even need a movie about monkeys in space. They already are monkeys in their own heads. They're crazy and lunatic. And I wish I was exaggerating here when I talk about this, but I've read video game websites on the internet over and over and over for the last 7 years or so. And I'm starting to realize that their hatred towards older generations is very real. And they have a deep black heart of prejudice against anything old, anything vintage, anything retro, anything antique, anything of collectible status, anything of like dusty gold or dusty vases or dusty controllers. They have this aversion towards old video games. And unfortunately, as time goes on, if these same modern video game pricks keep on giving false information on video games, we're going to be losing more and more old video games from the age of time, and old video games are going to start to die out in great large numbers. And the old games will vanish in history, and nobody in the future will be able to play any of these old video games. And any information in the past about the old video games will be like rumors about some kind of unrecorded concert or Shakespearean tragedy. And it's really sad. And I know I'm being a little bit rough and harsh here, but trust me, when there are commonplace video game reviewers and critics like these people who have excessive enjoyment of violence in video games and cruelty in video games and just flat out atheism and misrepresentation of religion in their general expressions and social manners, you know that these are not the kind of people who would not even be good on a political voting ticket. These people would be embarrassing to even mention for Joe Biden right now. I mean, these commonplace video game reviewers and critics are just usually just young people who want to play with new things and do not enjoy playing with old things, and it's generally because they do not like old people and old moments and old times and old histories and old materials. Because after all, they would even fear that somehow the old man would in some way compete well against the young man. And that is such the person you should take care to beware of. Take care.